Systemic mycosis are fungal infections that affect the internal organs of the body. In some instances, you can inhale different fungal spores. You might also be, if you're receiving steroid shots, and depending on where you get that treatment from, sometimes the shots you get can be compromised with a fungal contaminant, and that can obviously cause systemic mycosis throughout the body. So anytime you have a wound or an abrasion or so, and it's not treated properly, you might also acquire systemic mycosis as fungal infections make their way into your bloodstream. There's spores of many pathogenic fungi that can make their way into your respiratory system. You might inhale them from fecal material that's in the air that comes from either a bird or a bat, or just contaminants from the soil. So there's a number of ways, and this is what makes spores so deadly, is that they can get into your system because we can breathe them, we can eat them, and then once given the right opportunity, they can elicit infection and lead to systemic mycosis. So there's some pulmonary complications that are related to subcutaneous and systemic mycosis, blastomycosis, coccidioid mycosis, cryptococcus, as well as histoplasmosis. All of these are simply just a lot of respiratory complications that you would get that can lead to systemic mycosis and subcutaneous mycosis. The thing about fungus is that, remember, they are saprophytes, and given the type of fungus that you breathe in, they can attach to your tissue and use your tissue as a substrate to absorb nutrients, causing your tissue to break down. So you get a lot of necrosis in areas of the body which start to fall apart because they're very critical to your health. So anything that you breathe in, if it makes its way down to your lungs, there's a lot of oxygen present. There's it's a nice, moist, warm environment. So the conditions are very nice for a fungal organism to thrive and develop. Inhalation from common bread molds like Rhizopus stolonifer or Mucor subspecies, those can all lead to mycoses in patients, can lead to death in individuals that are immunocompromised. Can just be very, very dangerous. And a lot of people are allergic to different fungal organisms. So that's another aspect as to what can lead to systemic and subcutaneous mycosis. Diagnosis of mycosis, it takes place through immunodiagnostic procedures. You have to take a sample from a patient, and then you have to do some biochemical tests. You also have to do some staining in order to view your specimens underneath the microscope to identify them as fungal organisms. Dimorphic fungi, it's kind of a specialized category. Essentially what you have here are fungus that can either exist as both yeast or molds, and this is kind of determinant on the conditions in which the organism is living. So we call this dimorphism, which means you have an organism that is going to have yeast characteristics or mold characteristics given on where that particular organism is living. So for instance, when you grow an organism in vitro at 37 degrees Celsius, which is body temperature, dimorphic fungi will grow as a yeast, and it will produce yeast colonies. But if you change the temperature to, say, like 25 degrees Celsius, which is room temperature, then the dimorphic fungi will start to live and thrive as a mold, which is going to produce mold colonies. So remember, mold is going to have a stalk to it with a spore at the end of it, but a yeast is just going to be that budding balloon-like colony that I've showed you in previous images. And then in a scenario where you have the fungus living inside of a body or a human patient, you're going to see the fungi exist as a yeast species. Okay, so when we talk about dimorphism and dimorphic fungi, we're talking about fungi looking one way at a particular environment, and then looking or acting, behaving a different way in another environment. So the two examples we have here is 37 degrees Celsius and 25 degrees Celsius. Some examples of dimorphic fungi that can elicit human disease is Histoplasma capsulatum. We also have Sporothrix schnickii, coccidioides immitis, and then Blastomyces dermatitis. And then we've got some images here kind of outlining that dimorphic feature. At 25 degrees Celsius, this organism looks like it's growing in a filamentous kind of structure. And then at 37 degrees, we see the yeast cells being produced here. Okay, so let's talk about our next group of organisms, which are going to be the lichens and then the slime molds. These guys are kind of boring. I feel like lichens, pretty much you find them on trees and rocks, and it's just a lichen. It's a combination of algae and fungus growing together. We think that they have photosynthetic properties to them. We know that lichens have a mutualistic relationship, or exist as a mutualistic relationship between algae and fungus. Lichens fall underneath the protist category. So again, eukaryotic organisms, but they fall underneath the Protista kingdom. But really, lichens just kind of absorb nutrients from the trunks of trees that they grow on, as well as the rocks. And sometimes the lichens can absorb so much nutrients from the trees that it causes the trees to break down and die. So anytime you see a branch that maybe has fallen off a tree, a lot of times you see it covered completely in lichen, and a lot of times that lichen has helped to cause the degradation of that branch. On rocks, you have lichen basically thriving off of the inorganic materials in the rocks, also thriving off of some of the water that collects in crevices of rocks, so that's why you see lichen growing on rocks. Slime molds we find in the soil. We also find growing on rotting logs. These slime molds, they have both fungal and protozoal characteristics, and these two also fall underneath the Protista group. The name mold might confuse a little bit because you would think that, oh, that belongs in the fungus group, but no, slime molds are actually in their own kind of classification kingdom, and they're not in the fungi kingdom. They're in the Protista kingdom, so they're different. And here are some images of some lichen that you've probably seen maybe while doing a small hike somewhere. In South Carolina, we have lichen pretty much everywhere. So again, this typically is a mutualistic relationship consisting of a fungus and an algae growing together. Anytime you see the green attribute, you can think, oh, this probably has photosynthetic properties, and for the most part with lichen, we understand that to be the case. But at the same time, it also has fungal attributes, which help it to absorb nutrients and absorb things from wood that it grows on, as well as from material that it would leach from if it's growing on a rock. Okay, so those are the two images I could see. So this brings us to the conclusion of our chapter 5, which was wrapping up our part 2 microbial diversity. So I hope you learned a lot about fungus and about lichen and about algae and just some of the other different kind of microorganisms that are out there. Aside from the yeast and aside from some algae, most of these organisms typically you're not going to find growing on the human body unless there is some sort of far-fetched parasitic infection, primarily that's developed through fungus. But you're not really going to find anything with lichen. And then on a rare instance, you might find, some clinically significant algae that may impact a human's health. Okay, all right, so if you guys have any questions, as always, please don't hesitate to call me or contact me. Have a good day.